Marcus Chen had always been terrible with words when it came to women. At 28, the xenobiology researcher had published dozens of papers on alien life forms, but could barely manage small talk at the coffee machine. So when he spotted the most beautiful being he'd ever seen walking through the research station's main corridor, his brain did what it always did. It betrayed him completely. She wasn't human, that much was obvious. Her skin held a subtle lavender hue that shifted like oil on water under the artificial lights. Delicate ridges traced elegant patterns along her temples and down her neck, disappearing beneath the simple gray jumpsuit all research subjects wore. Her hair, if it could be called that, moved like liquid silver, defying gravity in gentle waves. But her eyes, deep amber with flecks of gold, those were what made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The Zephyrian delegation had arrived 3 days ago for the standard first contact protocols. Marcus had read the briefings. The aliens possessed technology far beyond human understanding, yet they'd approached Earth with curiosity rather than conquest. Their hearing, the reports mentioned, operated on different frequencies than humans. Most human speech registered as barely audible whispers to them, which was why all official communications required special translation devices. Marcus pressed himself against the corridor wall as she approached, clutching his datapad like a shield. She walked with an otherworldly grace, her attention focused on the viewing windows that showed Earth's blue marble hanging in space. The sight seemed to fascinate her, just as she fascinated him. His mouth opened before his brain could stop it. "What a lovely girl," he whispered under his breath, the words barely audible even to himself. It was the kind of comment he'd never dare say aloud, the sort of thing that lived in the safety of his own thoughts. The Zephyrian stopped walking. Marcus felt his heart slam against his ribs as she turned those golden eyes directly toward him. There was no confusion in her gaze, no need for translation. She had heard him perfectly, understood every word. The reports were wrong or incomplete or, "You think I am lovely?" she asked, her voice carrying a musical quality that made the translation device at her throat seem almost insulting to the beauty of her natural speech. Marcus's face burned with embarrassment. He fumbled with his datapad, nearly dropping it twice. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I thought you couldn't." The briefing said. She stepped closer, tilting her head in a gesture that was both alien and somehow familiar. "The briefings speak of my people's general hearing capabilities. They do not speak of individuals, of variations, of gifts." A smile played at the corners of her mouth, an expression that translated perfectly across species. "I have always heard things others could not." The corridor suddenly felt incredibly small. Marcus found himself studying the floor tiles with intense fascination. "I really didn't mean to. I wouldn't normally just comment on someone like that. It's inappropriate and I'm supposed to be professional and—" Marcus Chen. She knew his name. Of course she knew his name. He was probably in every briefing document she'd received. The xenobiology researcher who has studied 17 different alien species without ever meeting one face-to-face. He looked up, startled. She'd done research on him too. 18, actually. We just classified the crystalline entities from the Vega system last week. 18 then. That smile grew wider. "Tell me, Marcus Chen, in all your studies of alien species, have you ever encountered one capable of hearing the frequency of human thoughts?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "Thoughts? You can hear my thoughts?" Not thoughts precisely, but the subvocalizations, the tiny muscle movements your throat makes when you think words but do not speak them, the whispers you believe are silent. She gestured to her ears, which he now noticed were slightly more elaborate than he'd initially observed, with small, almost crystalline structures within. "My hearing extends far beyond what your briefings suggest." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Every embarrassing thought he'd had about her appearance, every mental comment about how beautiful she was, every moment he'd spent admiring her from afar over the past 3 days, she'd heard it all. "Oh no," he whispered, and immediately realized she'd heard that too. But instead of looking offended or disgusted, she laughed. The sound was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, beautiful and complex. "Do not look so horrified, Marcus Chen. In my culture, honest appreciation is considered a gift, not an offense. Your thoughts have been refreshing. Refreshing. Most humans who interact with my delegation speak in careful, measured words. Political phrases designed to avoid offense. But you... She stepped closer again, close enough that he could see the way the light played across those ridges on her skin. You speak truth even when you believe no one can hear it, even when you think it exists only in the privacy of your own mind. Marcus struggled to process this information. So you've been listening to my private observations for 3 days? I have been listening to poetry, she corrected gently. To genuine wonder and appreciation expressed without artifice or agenda. Do you know how rare that is in first contact situations? The hallway around them seemed to fade away. Marcus found himself caught in those amber eyes, trying to understand how his most embarrassing moment had somehow become something else entirely. I still don't understand why you're not offended. Because you see me, she said simply. Not as a political opportunity or a scientific curiosity or a potential threat. You see me as beautiful, as worthy of admiration. When was the last time someone looked at you that way, Marcus Chen? The question caught him off guard. When had someone last looked at him with genuine appreciation, rather than professional courtesy or polite interest? He couldn't remember. I am Liralai, she said, offering what appeared to be a traditional Zephyrian greeting gesture, her hand extended palm up. And I would very much like to continue this conversation somewhere more private, where you might feel comfortable enough to speak your whispers aloud. Marcus stared at her outstretched hand, his mind reeling. This was definitely not covered in any first contact protocol he'd ever read. Marcus led Liralai to the research station's observation deck, his hands trembling slightly as he input his access code. The space was designed for contemplation, with comfortable seating arranged before massive windows that offered an unobstructed view of Earth and the star field beyond. At this hour, it was mercifully empty. This is where I come to think, he said, immediately wondering why he'd shared that personal detail. I mean, when I need to process data or to listen to your own thoughts without fear of being overheard, Liralai finished, settling gracefully into one of the curved chairs. Except now you know that I can hear them anyway. Marcus remained standing, pacing nervously near the windows. This is incredibly awkward for me. I keep thinking about how you must have heard every embarrassing thought I've had, and then I realize you're hearing me think about how embarrassing it is, which makes it even more embarrassing. And, Marcus, her voice carried a gentle authority that made him stop mid-pace. Sit, please. He perched on the edge of a chair several feet away, still avoiding eye contact. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet hum of the station's life support systems. You called me lovely, Liralai said finally, but I do not think you truly understand what that word means to my people. Marcus looked up, caught by something in her tone.
What do you mean?
In Zephyrian culture, beauty is not merely aesthetic. It encompasses the harmony of thought, action, and intent. When you called me lovely, your subvocalizations carried layers of meaning you were not consciously expressing. She leaned forward slightly, her amber eyes intense. You were not simply commenting on my physical appearance. I wasn't. You spoke of grace in movement, intelligence in expression, kindness in the way I observed your planet. You saw depth where others see only surface differences. Her voice grew softer. In my language there is a word, Shivana, that describes the recognition of complete beauty in another being. It is considered one of the highest compliments possible. Marcus felt his face heating up again. I just thought you were... I didn't realize I was saying all that. The mind speaks more honestly than the mouth, Liralai said. Your conscious words might have been simple, but your deeper thoughts revealed someone who sees beyond the obvious. She gestured toward Earth hanging in the viewport. Just as you see your planet not merely as a sphere of rock and water, but as a living system of infinite complexity and wonder. The comparison surprised him. How do you know what I think about Earth? Because I have been listening to your whispers for 3 days, remember? When you stand at these windows during your breaks, you compose entire symphonies of appreciation in your subconscious mind. The way sunlight catches cloud formations, the mathematical beauty of storm systems, the elegance of orbital mechanics. She smiled. You think in poetry, Marcus Chen, even when you believe you are thinking in scientific terms. Marcus stood and walked to the windows, pressing his palm against the cool surface. Below them, Earth turned slowly, city lights beginning to twinkle as the Terminator line moved across continents. I've always seen patterns everywhere. Connections. It's what made me good at xenobiology. seeing how alien life forms fit into their environments, how every adaptation serves a purpose. "And what pattern do you see in this moment?" Lyreley asked, rising to stand beside him. He glanced at her reflection in the window, surprised by how natural it seemed to have her there. "I see two beings from entirely different worlds, with completely different evolutionary backgrounds, and yet—" He paused, struggling to articulate something he barely understood himself. "And yet we find common ground in appreciation of beauty, in curiosity about the universe, in the desire to connect with something beyond ourselves," she finished. "Exactly." He turned to face her directly. "But that should be impossible. The odds against our species developing compatible concepts of beauty, compatible emotional responses, compatible ways of processing wonder, they're astronomical." Lyreley's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps compatibility is not about odds. Perhaps it is about recognition." "What do you mean?" "Your species has a concept, convergent evolution, yes. When unrelated organisms independently develop similar traits because they serve similar functions." At his nod, she continued, "What if consciousness itself tends toward certain universal patterns? What if the capacity for wonder, for appreciation of beauty, for the desire to connect, what if these emerge naturally in any sufficiently complex intelligence?" Marcus felt a familiar thrill, the same rush he experienced when a particularly elegant theory clicked into place. "You're suggesting that aesthetic appreciation is an evolutionary inevitability, that any species advanced enough for space travel would necessarily develop similar capacities for recognizing and creating beauty." "More than that," Lyreley said, moving closer to the window. "I am suggesting that beauty itself might be a fundamental property of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. Something that intelligent life doesn't create but discovers." The idea was staggering in its implications. Marcus found himself unconsciously leaning toward her, drawn by the excitement of intellectual connection. If that's true, then first contact between any two species should naturally involve recognition of shared aesthetic values. Art, music, poetry, they'd be universal languages. "Yes, but—" Lyreley turned to look at him, and he was struck again by the impossible depth of her eyes. "What happens when two beings discover they speak the same language of beauty? When they recognize in each other not just intelligence, but kindred appreciation for wonder itself?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Marcus realized they were standing very close now, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns of bioluminescence flickering along those ridges on her skin, close enough that he could hear the soft sound of her breathing, different from human respiratory patterns but somehow musical. "I don't know," he whispered, and for once he spoke the words aloud intentionally. "But I'd like to find out." Lyreley's smile was radiant. "So would I, Marcus Chen, so would I." 3 weeks had passed since that first conversation on the observation deck, and Marcus found himself living in a strange new reality. The research station buzzed with formal diplomatic activities, trade negotiations, technology exchanges, cultural briefings, but beneath it all, he and Lyreley had discovered something unprecedented in the history of first contact. Friendship that transcended species barriers. She had become his constant companion during off-duty hours. They met each morning in the hydroponics bay, where Lyreley expressed fascination with Earth's plant life. She would stand among the tomato vines and lettuce beds, her enhanced hearing picking up sounds Marcus never knew existed, the whisper of roots growing through soil, the barely audible pop of cell walls expanding, the complex chemical conversations plants conducted through airborne compounds. "Your species grows food with such care," she observed, gently touching a cucumber leaf. "Each plant is treated as an individual, given exactly what it needs to flourish. On my world, we synthesize nutrients directly. Efficient, but—" She paused, searching for words. "But not beautiful," Marcus finished. He'd grown comfortable completing her thoughts just as she often finished his. "Not beautiful, yes. There is no poetry in molecular assembly, no patience required, no trust that life will find its way if given proper conditions." She turned to him, her amber eyes bright with curiosity. "Do you think this reflects a fundamental difference between our species? Humans nurture what they wish to preserve, while Zephyrians engineer what they wish to control." It was the kind of question that would have intimidated Marcus a month ago. Too philosophical, too personal, too much like the sort of deep conversation he always stumbled through. But with Lyreley, He found himself capable of articulation he'd never possessed before. Maybe it's about timescales, he suggested, kneeling to examine the root structure of a bean plant. Humans live short lives relative to cosmic events. We have to trust processes we won't live to see completed. We plant trees knowing our children will enjoy their shade. That requires a certain faith in continuity. And Zephyrians live for millennia, Lyralai said thoughtfully. We see the completion of most cycles we begin. Perhaps that makes us more inclined toward control, less willing to accept uncertainty. Marcus looked up at her, struck by a sudden realization. How old are you? By your measurements? Approximately 430 years. The number should have been shocking, should have created an unbridgeable gulf between them. Instead, Marcus found himself laughing. I'm 28. You've been alive for longer than my entire civilization has had written language. Lyralai settled gracefully onto the floor beside him, apparently unconcerned about her uniform getting dirty. And yet you speak to me as an equal. You debate with me, challenge my assumptions, offer insights I had never considered. Age is merely accumulated time, Marcus. Wisdom is something entirely different. What do you mean? I have lived through the rise and fall of 3 Zephyrian governments, witnessed the discovery of 12 sentient species, seen entire star systems born and die. Her voice grew distant. But until I heard your whispered appreciation of beauty, I had never understood the difference between observation and genuine wonder. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of profound trust. You make it sound like I taught you something important. You taught me everything important, Lyralai said simply. For 4 centuries, I approached the universe as a collection of facts to be catalogued, processes to be understood, phenomena to be explained. But you showed me that knowledge without appreciation is merely data, that understanding without love is incomplete. The word love hung between them, neither romantic nor platonic, but something else entirely, a recognition of shared reverence for existence itself. Marcus found himself studying the intricate patterns of bioluminescence along her temples, the way they pulsed gently in rhythm with her emotions. Can I ask you something? He said quietly. Always. Why me? I mean, your delegation includes historians, artists, philosophers, beings who should be much better at this kind of conversation than a xenobiology researcher who can barely order coffee without embarrassing himself. Lyralai was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on the play of artificial sunlight through the hydroponic arrays. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Marcus understand he was hearing something important. Do you know what first drew my people to Earth? The radio signals, I thought. Evidence of technological intelligence. No, she said, surprising him. We detected your radio transmissions centuries ago. What finally motivated us to make contact was something much more recent. Marcus waited, sensing this was leading somewhere significant. 18 months ago, your space telescopes detected an exoplanet in a distant system, a world with oceans and continents and weather patterns. When your scientists published their observations, they included something we had never encountered before in the literature of any species. She turned to look at him directly. They described the planet as beautiful. The words hit Marcus like a revelation. You came here because we called a planet beautiful? We came here because faced with a distant world you would never visit, could never touch, could gain nothing from, you still recognized its aesthetic value. You appreciated its beauty for its own sake, not for any practical purpose. Lyralai's eyes were luminous with emotion. In all our centuries of studying other species, we had never encountered beings who could find beauty in the purely theoretical, wonder in the completely abstract. Marcus felt his understanding of the situation shifting fundamentally. So when you heard me whisper about your appearance, I heard a demonstration of the very quality that brought us to your species in the first place. The capacity to recognize beauty without agenda, to appreciate wonder without expectation of gain. She reached out, her fingers stopping just short of touching his hand. You represent the best of what makes humanity unique in the galaxy, Marcus Chen, and you do not even know it. The implications were staggering. Marcus realized that their growing friendship wasn't just a personal connection. It was a bridge between 2 completely different ways of experiencing the universe. A living proof that appreciation of beauty might indeed be a universal language, capable of transcending any barrier evolution could create. What happens now? He asked, Lyralay's smile held mysteries he was only beginning to understand. Now we discover what wonders two species can create together when they speak the same language of appreciation. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning with an emergency alert that brought every person on the research station to full attention. Marcus was in his lab, analyzing samples from the latest shipment of Zephyrian biological specimens, when Commander Harrison's voice echoed through the station's communication system. All personnel to emergency stations. We have a Priority 1 situation developing. This is not a drill. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Priority 1 meant imminent threat to life, either from system failure or external attack. He abandoned his samples and rushed toward the command center, where he found chaos barely contained by military discipline. "What's happening?" he asked Lieutenant Commander Torres, who was frantically coordinating with different departments. "Long-range sensors picked up a massive fleet approaching our position," Torres replied without looking up from her displays. "Configuration unknown, but the energy signatures suggest weapons capability far beyond anything we've seen. They'll be here in 6 hours." Marcus's blood ran cold. "Zephyrian ships." "Negative. These readings don't match any known Zephyrian technology. Whatever's coming, it's not friendly." Torres finally looked at him, her expression grim. "And Chen?" "The Zephyrian delegation is requesting immediate emergency conference with senior staff. They seem to know something about our visitors." Marcus found Lyralay in Conference Room Alpha, surrounded by her delegation and the station's senior command staff. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and for the first time since meeting her, Marcus saw genuine fear in Lyralay's amber eyes. "Marcus," she said as he entered, relief evident in her voice. "I was hoping you would be here." Commander Harrison gestured for Marcus to take a seat. "Dr. Chen, we need every available expert for this briefing. Lyralay has some disturbing information about our approaching visitors." Lyralay stood, her usual grace replaced by nervous energy. "The ships you have detected belong to a species we call the Devourers. They are difficult to explain in your language." "Try," Harrison said grimly. "Imagine a civilization that has perfected the art of consumption, not just physical resources, but knowledge, culture, even the essence of what makes a species unique." Lyralay's bioluminescent patterns flickered rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "They do not conquer worlds, they digest them. They absorb everything of value and leave behind empty husks." Marcus felt the room's temperature seem to drop. "How many worlds?" 47 confirmed, probably more. The answer came from another Zephyrian, one Marcus recognized as their military attaché. "They have been moving through this galactic arm for approximately 2,000 years. No species has successfully resisted them." "None?" Harrison's voice was carefully controlled. "The crystalline hegemony lasted 18 months. The Vorth Federation managed 2 years before complete absorption. The longest resistance came from the builders of Kepler 442. They held out for nearly 5 years." Lyralay's voice grew quieter. "In every case, the result was the same. Total cultural extinction." Marcus's mind raced through the implications. "Why haven't you warned us before? Why are you here at all if this threat exists?" Lyralay exchanged glances with her fellow delegates. "Because we believed they were still centuries away from reaching this system. Our intelligence suggested they were occupied with absorption protocols in the Vega region." She turned to Marcus, and he could see the weight of responsibility in her eyes. "We came to establish formal relations with humanity before the threat materialized. We hope to prepare you to share defensive technologies to give your species a better chance than the others had." "But something changed," Harrison said. "It wasn't a question. 3 days ago, our long-range communication arrays detected Devourer scout transmissions from this system," the military attaché confirmed. "They accelerated their timeline. Instead of centuries, we have hours." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of air recycling systems. Marcus could see the defeat in every face around the table, human and Zephyrian alike. How could a single research station, even one equipped with the best human technology, possibly resist a force that had consumed 47 entire civilizations? "There must be something," Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "Some weakness, some pattern in their tactics, something that explains why they keep winning." Lyralay looked at him with something like hope. "What do you mean?" Marcus stood and began pacing, his mind shifting into the analytical mode that had made him successful at xenobiology. "You said they absorb culture, knowledge, the essence of what makes species unique." That suggests they're not just randomly destructive, they're selective. They're looking for something specific. Go on, Harrison said. If they wanted simple resources, metals, energy, basic materials, they could strip uninhabited worlds without the complexity of fighting advanced civilizations. But they specifically target sentient species. They go through the effort of studying cultures before absorbing them. Marcus turned to face the group. That means they value something only intelligent life can provide. Lorelai's eyes widened. You think they need something from consciousness itself? Exactly. But what could be so valuable that it's worth the risk and effort of conquering advanced civilizations? What could only come from intelligent, creative beings? The answer hit him like a physical blow, so obvious he couldn't believe he'd missed it initially. Beauty, he whispered. Lorelai stared at him in shock. What did you say? Beauty, Marcus repeated louder now. Aesthetic appreciation. Art, music, poetry, the capacity to find wonder in the universe. Think about it. It's the one thing that can't be synthesized or manufactured. It can only emerge from genuine consciousness, from beings capable of experiencing wonder. But how does that help us? Torres asked. If they want our capacity for beauty, how is that a weakness? Marcus felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a pattern so elegant it took his breath away. Because they're parasites, not creators. They consume beauty but cannot generate it themselves. They need us alive to experience wonder, but their very presence destroys the conditions necessary for genuine aesthetic appreciation. He turned to Lorelai, excitement growing in his voice. Your people came to Earth because we called a distant planet beautiful, remember? Because we could appreciate wonder without agenda, find beauty in things we could never possess or profit from. That's what makes the devourers vulnerable. I don't understand, Harrison said. They can only consume beauty that already exists, Marcus explained. But genuine aesthetic appreciation, the kind that creates new art, new music, new poetry, only emerges from freedom, from security, from the space to contemplate wonder without fear. He looked around the room. They can't force beings to create beauty at gunpoint. Fear destroys the very thing they need most. Lorelai was staring at him with dawning comprehension. You think we can use their dependency against them? I think, Marcus said slowly, that we might be able to show them something they've never encountered before. Something so beautiful, so genuine, so impossible to replicate through conquest, that it changes their entire approach to existence. The room erupted in voices as everyone began talking at once, but Marcus only had eyes for Lorelai, who was looking at him with an expression of wonder that made his heart race. Do you really think it could work? She asked quietly. Marcus reached out and took her hand, feeling the subtle warmth of her alien physiology. I think, he said, that we're about to find out what happens when two species who speak the same language of beauty face down creatures who have forgotten how to create wonder of their own. The next 4 hours transformed the research station into something unprecedented in the history of first contact. Instead of preparing for battle, Marcus and Lorelai found themselves coordinating the most ambitious collaborative art project ever attempted between two species. The beauty has to be genuine, Marcus explained to the assembled crowd in the main conference hall. Forced creation, art made under duress. The devourers will recognize it instantly as inferior. We need something that emerges naturally from our combined appreciation of wonder. Commander Harrison looked skeptical. Dr. Chen, I understand the theory, but we're talking about beings who have conquered 47 civilizations. How can a collaborative art project possibly? Because no species has ever tried this approach, Lorelai interrupted. Every civilization they've encountered has responded with either submission or military resistance. But aesthetic defense, beauty as a weapon, this is entirely outside their experience. Marcus activated the main display, showing a schematic he'd hastily drawn up. We're going to create something that demonstrates the emergence of beauty through cooperation. Something that proves aesthetic appreciation grows stronger when different perspectives combine rather than when one consumes another. What kind of something? Torres asked. Marcus looked at Lorelai, who nodded encouragingly. A garden. A living artwork that incorporates earth botanical specimens with Zephyrian cultivation techniques. But not just plants, we'll integrate human music with Zephyrian harmonic theory. Combine our mathematical concepts of proportion with their understanding of bioluminescent patterns. A garden that sings? Lorelai added, her eyes bright with excitement. A space where every element contributes to a symphony of growth, color, sound, and movement. Something that could only exist through genuine collaboration between our species. The next 3 hours blurred together in controlled chaos. The station's hydroponics bay was transformed into something magical. As humans and Zephyrians worked side by side, Marcus found himself orchestrating the placement of earth flowers, according to patterns that Lyrelei hummed, mathematical sequences that translated into visual harmonies he'd never imagined possible. Dr. Sarah Kim, the station's botanist, worked with Zephyrian biotechnicians to create hybrid growing mediums that sparkled with mineral compounds unknown to Earth science. The plants responded by growing in configurations that seemed to defy gravity, reaching toward light sources in spiraling patterns that matched the golden ratio. Meanwhile, the station's small group of musicians collaborated with Zephyrian sound engineers to develop ambient compositions that responded to the garden's growth patterns. As plants expanded and flowers bloomed, the music evolved, creating an ever-changing symphony of natural and technological harmony. "It's working," Lyrelei whispered to Marcus as they stood at the center of their creation. Around them, the garden pulsed with life and light, filled with the soft sounds of growth and the gentle melodies of interspecies cooperation. But Marcus was staring at the readings on his tablet, and his expression was grim. "They're here." The Devourer ships materialized on the station's sensors like nightmares given form. Massive angular vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their very presence causing interference with the station's instruments. Commander Harrison's voice echoed through the communication system. "All personnel to emergency stations. Unknown vessels are requesting permission to board." They're transmitting something. The transmission that came through was unlike anything anyone had heard before. It wasn't quite language, not exactly music, but something that combined elements of both into a form of communication that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the emotional centers of the brain. Marcus felt his knees weaken as the sound washed over him. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a cry of hunger so profound it seemed to encompass entire worlds, entire civilizations, entire histories of loss and consumption. It spoke of endless searching, endless consuming, endless disappointment as each absorbed culture failed to fill a void that grew larger with every conquest. "They're in pain," Lyrelei gasped, her hand finding Marcus's arm for support. "Can you hear it? They're not conquerors, they're addicts. They consume beauty because they've forgotten how to create it, but nothing they absorb ever satisfies them." Marcus understood. The Devourers weren't evil in any conventional sense. They were beings who had become trapped in a cycle of aesthetic dependency, forever seeking the perfect experience of beauty but destroying it in the act of consumption. "Permission to board granted." Harrison's voice came over the comm. "All personnel maintain positions. Let's see what they want." What walked onto the research station 15 minutes later defied easy description. The Devourers moved like living shadows, their forms constantly shifting between something humanoid and something far more alien. But their eyes, those were unmistakably the eyes of beings who had seen too much, consumed too much, experienced too much without ever finding satisfaction. They moved through the station's corridors with purpose, ignoring the humans and Zephyrians who pressed themselves against walls to let them pass. Their destination was clear. They were heading straight for the transformed hydroponics bay where Marcus and Lyrelei's garden continued to grow and sing. Marcus and Lyrelei met them at the entrance to their creation. Up close, the Devourers were even more unsettling, beings whose very presence seemed to create a void in the air around them. But as they stood at the threshold of the garden, something changed. The lead Devourer stopped moving. Its shifting form stabilized into something almost human, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with emotion. "What is this place?" it asked in perfectly understandable English. Marcus felt Lyrelei's hand squeeze his arm. This was the moment everything depended on. "It's a collaboration," he said simply. "A space where two different species learn to create beauty together instead of trying to possess it individually." The Devourer stepped into the garden, and Marcus held his breath. Would their creation survive contact with a being whose very nature was consumption? Would the beauty they'd made together be absorbed and destroyed like every other culture the Devourers had encountered? Instead, something unprecedented happened. The plants responded to the devourer's presence not by withering, but by growing more vibrant. The music swelled rather than fading. The bioluminescent patterns that Lyrelai's people had contributed began to pulse in rhythm with the devourer's shifting form. "It does not diminish," the devourer whispered, and Marcus could hear centuries of surprise in its voice. "We touch it and it grows stronger. Because it's based on cooperation rather than consumption," Lyrelai said gently. "Beauty that emerges from connection cannot be possessed, it can only be shared." The devourer turned to look at them, and Marcus saw something he hadn't expected to see in those ancient eyes: hope. "Show us," the creature said. "Show us how to create rather than consume. Show us how to find satisfaction in growth rather than in taking." Marcus looked at Lyrelai, seeing his own wonder reflected in her amber eyes. They had done something impossible. They had found a way to heal beings whose hunger had consumed entire civilizations. "The first lesson," Marcus said, extending his hand toward the devourer, "is learning to appreciate beauty you cannot possess, like calling a distant planet lovely, even though you'll never visit it." The devourer stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then slowly it reached out and made contact. The garden around them erupted in new growth. New music, new light. Beauty multiplied rather than divided. Wonder shared rather than stolen. And Marcus realized that his whispered compliment in a corridor 3 weeks ago had somehow become the key to ending a cycle of cosmic tragedy that had lasted 2,000 years. 6 months later, the research station had become something no one could have imagined. A thriving artistic colony where 3 species worked together to explore the boundaries of collaborative beauty. The transformation had been gradual but profound, watched by billions across human space and beyond. Marcus stood in what had once been the main conference room, now converted into a space where devourer harmonic theory met human mathematical concepts and Zephyrian biotechnology. The walls themselves had become living canvases, covered with organisms that responded to emotional states and musical frequencies, creating ever-changing murals that reflected the mood and creativity of everyone in the room. "The integration is proceeding faster than our most optimistic projections," Lyrelai reported, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed the impossible become routine. "The devourer colonies are not only surviving without consumption-based expansion, they're actively contributing to the aesthetic development of their host systems." Dr. Vex, the lead devourer researcher, flickered between forms as they processed this information. Marcus had learned to read their shape changes as emotional expressions. Rapid shifting indicated excitement, while the current slow, deliberate transformation suggested deep contemplation. "The difficulty," Vex said in their melodious voice, "lies not in creating beauty collaboratively, but in unlearning the reflexive urge to possess it completely. 2,000 years of consuming rather than cultivating has left us with instincts that work against cooperative aesthetics." Marcus nodded sympathetically. He'd spent the past months working directly with former devourer colonies, helping them establish what they called cultivation gardens, spaces where beauty could grow and change without being harvested or absorbed. The process required patience and constant vigilance against old habits. "What about the Kepler system?" he asked. Last reports suggested they were struggling with the transition. "They are learning," Vex replied, their form stabilizing into something vaguely humanoid. The Devourer Collective there had consumed 17 civilizations over the past millennium. Their hunger patterns are deeply entrenched. But yesterday, they successfully maintained a collaborative music synthesis for 6 uninterrupted hours without attempting to absorb the contributing harmonies. Lyrelai smiled. "That represents significant progress. When we first arrived at Kepler, they couldn't sustain cooperative aesthetics for more than 30 minutes before reverting to consumption behaviors." Marcus felt the familiar thrill of witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the rehabilitation of a species-wide addiction to consuming beauty, but the emergence of entirely new forms of art that could only exist through multi-species collaboration. "Marcus," Dr. Vex said suddenly, their attention shifting to him with an intensity that still made him slightly uncomfortable, "we have received communication from the Galactic Preservation Council. They wish to formally recognize what has happened here." The Galactic Preservation Council was a legendary organization. Species so advanced they rarely involved themselves in the affairs of younger civilizations. For them to take notice of the events surrounding the Devourer rehabilitation was extraordinary. What kind of recognition? Marcus asked. They want to establish what they are calling the Chin-Liralai Protocol, Vex replied, a formal set of procedures for using collaborative aesthetics to resolve conflicts between civilizations. They believe your approach could prevent countless future wars and cultural extinctions. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. It wasn't just us. Everyone on the station contributed, and the breakthrough only happened because we had 3 different perspectives working together. Which is precisely why they want to formalize the protocol, Liralai said gently. Not to give credit to individuals, but to establish a framework for the kind of cooperation that made this possible. Commander Harrison entered the room, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal amazement. Even after 6 months, she still seemed surprised by how radically their situation had evolved. Dr. Chen, Liralai, Dr. Vex, she said, nodding to each in turn. I have news from Earth Command and the Zephyrian High Council. They've approved the establishment of the first Collaborative Aesthetics Institute. Joint funding, joint research, joint operation. Marcus exchanged glances with Liralai. They'd proposed the institute 3 months ago as a way to study and develop the principles they'd discovered during the Devourer crisis. The approval represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between human and Zephyrian governments. Where will it be located? Liralai asked. Harrison smiled. Right here. This station will be expanded and converted into a permanent research facility dedicated to exploring the role of beauty and wonder in interspecies relations. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. And they want you to be the first director. The offer should have been thrilling, but Marcus found himself hesitating. I'm not sure I'm qualified to run something that important. Marcus, Vex said, their form shifting into patterns that indicated gentle amusement. You are the being who recognized that beauty cannot be possessed, only shared. You saw that aesthetic appreciation grows stronger through cooperation rather than competition. You understood that genuine wonder emerges from freedom, not force. Their shape stabilized. If you are not qualified to guide the study of collaborative beauty, then no one is. Marcus looked around the room, at Liralai with her gentle encouragement, at Harrison with her practical confidence, at Vex with their hard-won wisdom about the dangers of consuming rather than cultivating wonder. 6 months ago, he'd been a xenobiology researcher who couldn't manage small talk. Now he was being asked to direct an institute that might change the course of galactic civilization. What would we study? He asked. Everything, Liralai said, her eyes bright with possibility. The mathematical basis of cross-species aesthetic appreciation. The neurological foundations of collaborative creativity. The social structures that promote cooperative rather than competitive beauty-making. The prevention protocols for aesthetic addiction, Vex added. Methods for identifying civilizations at risk of developing consumption-based approaches to beauty. Early intervention techniques. And the practical applications, Harrison concluded. Diplomatic protocols, conflict resolution through collaborative art. Techniques for establishing common ground between species with radically different sensory modalities. Marcus felt the weight of possibility settling around him like a mantle. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. What about us? He asked Liralai quietly. What happens to... He gestured vaguely between them, unsure how to articulate the relationship that had developed over the past months. It wasn't romance in any conventional sense. They were, after all, members of completely different species. But it was something deeper than friendship, something that transcended the usual categories of connection. What happens to the first successful case study in interspecies collaborative aesthetics? Liralai finished with a smile. I think we continue to be exactly what we are, proof that beauty shared between different kinds of consciousness creates something greater than the sum of its parts. Marcus looked out through the viewport, at the small fleet of ships surrounding the station, human, Zephyrian, and former Devourer vessels working together on various research projects. In the distance, he could see the lights of the construction platforms that would expand the station into a proper institute. I have one condition, he said finally. What's that? Harrison asked. Marcus turned to look at his companions, beings from 3 different species who had somehow learned to speak the same language of wonder. The first rule of the Institute has to be that beauty belongs to everyone and to no one, that it can be shared infinitely without diminishing. That the moment we try to possess wonder, we lose it. Agreed, said Harrison. Agreed, said Lyrelay. Most emphatically agreed, said Vex, their form shifting into patterns of deep satisfaction. Marcus nodded and turned back to the viewport. In 6 months, they'd gone from first contact to collaborative crisis resolution, to establishing the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. And it had all started with a whispered compliment he'd thought no one could hear. Then let's build something beautiful, he said. 5 years had passed since the establishment of the Collaborative Aesthetics Institute, and Marcus Chen stood in the newly completed Hall of Universal Wonder, watching representatives from 37 different species work, together on projects that would have been unimaginable when he first whispered his appreciation of a beautiful alien girl. The hall itself was a masterpiece of cooperative architecture. Crystalline supports grown by the former devourers created impossible geometries that human engineers had designed, and Zephyrian biotechnicians had brought to life. The space hummed with activity, not just the sounds of construction and research, but the deeper harmonics of genuine collaboration across species barriers. The Andorian delegation has made remarkable progress, Lyrelay reported, joining him at the observation platform. Her appearance had changed subtly over the years. Working so closely with human and devourer colleagues had influenced her bioluminescent patterns, creating new configurations that reflected the hybrid aesthetic they'd all begun to develop. Marcus smiled at her approach. Their relationship had evolved too, becoming something that defied easy categorization. They were partners in every sense, intellectual, emotional, and in ways that transcended the usual definitions of connection between individuals. What they'd built together had become a model for the kind of deep collaboration the Institute promoted. What kind of progress? He asked. They've successfully integrated their magnetic field manipulation abilities with human dance and Zephyrian sonic theory. The result is a form of performance art that exists in 4 dimensions simultaneously: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and electromagnetic. Lyrelay's eyes sparkled with the same wonder that had captivated him years ago. The audience doesn't just watch or hear the performance, they feel it as subtle changes in the magnetic fields around their bodies. Marcus shook his head in amazement. 5 years ago, he'd thought cross-species cooperation meant sharing research data and establishing trade agreements. Now they were witnessing the emergence of entirely new forms of consciousness expression that required multiple species working in perfect harmony. And the evaluation from the Preservation Council? He asked. Beyond their expectations. They're recommending expansion to 15 new systems, with full funding for satellite institutes. Lyrelay moved to stand beside him, her presence as comfortable and natural as breathing. Marcus, we've succeeded beyond our wildest hopes. The Chen-Lyrelay protocol has prevented 17 potential conflicts, facilitated peaceful first contact with 12 new species, and created a framework for cooperation that's being adopted across 3 spiral arms. It should have felt like victory, but Marcus found himself contemplating something more complex. Do you ever worry that we're changing something fundamental about the nature of beauty itself? Lyrelay turned to study his profile. What do you mean? I mean, we've systematized wonder. We've created protocols for appreciation, methodologies for collaborative aesthetics. Are we turning something that should be spontaneous and natural into an academic discipline? It was a question that had been haunting Marcus for months as the Institute's success grew. The more refined their techniques became, the more formal their approach to fostering interspecies collaboration, the more he worried about losing the essential spontaneity that had made their original breakthrough possible. Do you remember, Lyrelay said quietly, what you whispered about me in that corridor 5 years ago? Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the passage of time. You mean my completely inappropriate comment about your appearance? I mean your completely honest appreciation of beauty you encountered unexpectedly. Lyrelay's voice carried gentle correction. You didn't plan to find me beautiful. You didn't analyze the aesthetic implications of cross-species attraction. You simply recognized wonder and expressed it naturally. Exactly my point. What we did then was instinctive, unguarded. Now we have committees and protocols and formal methodologies for... Marcus. Lyrelay's interruption was firm but affectionate. Look around this hall. Really look. Marcus followed her gesture, studying the space with more attention than his casual observation had provided. What he saw made him pause. Yes, there were formal research projects and structured collaborations, but there was also something else, spontaneous interactions happening everywhere. A group of young humans and Zephyrians had gathered around a devourer who was demonstrating some complex harmonic technique, but they weren't taking notes or following protocols. They were laughing and trying to mimic the sounds, creating accidental harmonies that made everyone smile. Near the botanical section, researchers from 4 different species were debating the aesthetic merits of a flower arrangement, their discussion growing animated as they discovered unexpected commonalities in their appreciation of proportion and color. The structure doesn't eliminate spontaneity, Lyreley continued. It creates safe spaces for spontaneity to happen. The protocols don't replace natural wonder. They remove the barriers that prevent beings from expressing wonder honestly. Marcus watched a former devourer named Zeph working alongside Dr. Kim on what appeared to be a musical garden. Zeph's form was shifting rapidly, a sign of excitement, as they discovered some new possibility in the combination of human botanical knowledge and devourer harmonic theory. The joy on Dr. Kim's face was unmistakable as she watched plants respond to sound frequencies in ways that challenged everything she'd thought she knew about biology. We haven't systematized beauty, Marcus realized aloud. We've systematized the conditions that allow beauty to emerge naturally. Exactly. Lyreley's smile held depths of satisfaction. Just as your whispered appreciation wasn't planned or calculated, but happened because you felt safe enough to express wonder honestly. We've simply learned to create that safety on a larger scale. Marcus felt something click into place in his understanding. The Institute wasn't changing the nature of beauty. It was protecting it from the forces that typically prevented its expression between different species. Fear, misunderstanding, the assumption that differences meant incompatibility rather than opportunity for richer collaboration. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Suddenly Lyreley raised an eyebrow in a gesture that had become beautifully hybrid, part human expression, part Zephyrian body language. What's that? I've been offered a position heading up the new institute at Alpha Centauri. Full directorship, unlimited research budget, first chance to implement the protocol with species we haven't encountered yet. He watched her process this information, seeing the quick flicker of surprise followed by something more complex. It's an incredible opportunity, she said carefully. It is, and I'm not taking it. Lyreley's bioluminescent patterns flared briefly, surprise and relief in equal measure. Why not? Marcus turned to face her fully, reaching out to take her hands in his. The gesture had become natural over the years, a connection that transcended the differences in their physiology. Because I've learned something important about beauty and collaboration, he said. The most profound wonders don't come from individual achievement or perfect conditions. They come from finding someone who speaks the same language of appreciation and choosing to explore that language together, even when it means turning down other possibilities. Lyreley's eyes grew luminous with emotion. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that my whispered comment about a lovely girl 5 years ago led to the most important discovery in galactic history. But more than that, it led to finding the being I want to share every wonder with for the rest of my life. Marcus smiled. However long or short that life might be compared to yours. Marcus Chen, Lyreley said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. Are you proposing some kind of permanent collaboration? I'm proposing that we continue being what we've always been. Proof that beauty shared between different kinds of consciousness creates something greater than the sum of its parts. I'm proposing that we keep discovering what that means together, for as long as the universe gives us. Lyreley's answer came not in words, but in the sudden brilliance of her bioluminescent patterns, a display of joy so radiant that it caught the attention of researchers throughout the hall. Within moments, they were surrounded by beings from a dozen different species, all drawn by the obvious celebration happening between the Institute's co-founders. As congratulations and well wishes flowed around them in a dozen different languages and communication modalities, Marcus realized that their personal moment had become something larger, a demonstration of the very principles the Institute promoted. Beauty shared rather than possessed, wonder celebrated rather than hoarded, connection that transcended individual identity to create something new and extraordinary. 5 years ago, he'd whispered an appreciation he thought no one could hear, Now, surrounded by friends and colleagues from across the galaxy, he understood that the most important conversations were always meant to be overheard, shared, and celebrated by anyone capable of recognizing beauty in its infinite forms. "What do you think happens next?" Lirelei whispered, her voice pitched for his ears alone, despite knowing that others around them would catch fragments of meaning.